Hello. Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. I screwed up on the meeting. I thought I had another week. I was sure I had another week. So I don't know. So we'll see if anybody finds this. But so finals coming up. It will open Friday of this week. Caroline, you're going to have a review on Wednesday. Is that correct?
Yep, we'll have SI on Wednesday at 11 and 11:30 like normal.
Okay. All right. I have review stuff kind of posted. I have the essay questions and I have a review PowerPoint, which I think I'll record into a program because people probably won't find this. And so I'll just record a program there. And so I'll go through the beginning here where I'm kind of stalling. Because in case anybody shows up, but we'll see. I'll just be here the whole time for an hour. So, okay. Michelle, would you like to do some review? Yes? Maybe? Okay. All right. Okay. Let's look at essay questions and stuff like that. So let me see if I can share here. Okay, so I think so I have essay questions. There'll be essay questions on the exam. I think I have 5 of them. So first one is on body temperature, their regulation. So it's the negative feedback system.
Are we going to have only 2 essays like usual, or is there going to be more for the final?
There'll just be 2 like usual, but I have 5 questions because there's more stuff. So what I'll probably do is split them up. So you'll get one of the first 3 for the first question and one of the last 2 for the second. So that you get something that's kind of from previous and something that's from more recent. So the first 2 are kind of on homeostatic systems, body temperature, which involves the skin and the brain, the hypothalamus, and control of blood flow in the skin and control of perspiration. And you can kind of think muscles too because of shivering. So it involves several systems. In the second essay question, that's involving the homeostatic control of calcium, which is skeletal system, and it's really a couple glands. So you have the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands, which are in your neck just below your Adam's apple. And these release hormones. If it's the parathyroid gland, it's going to cause you to release calcium from bone. If it's the thyroid gland, it releases calcitonin that's storing calcium. So I'm just good to see Asia and Miranda. I'm just going over essay questions.
I
And
didn't
so
know we
they'll,
were doing it at 11.
well, I screwed up. And so I just put an hour thing in, and whoever shows up will show up. I'll be here the whole time.
Okay.
And so we'll see what happens.
I'm
So
glad.
anyway, I'm going over essay questions. So the first three would be, you'll get your choice on one of the questions. It'll be 1, 2, or 3. And on the second question, it'll be 4 or 5. So you'll get 2 essay questions. They'll probably be worth about the same or maybe a little bit more than regular.
And are they posted in Moodle,
They're posted in Moodle.
or are they the questions that we've already gone over?
There's some of them you've gone over similar questions, but like the last 2, those are questions that are coming from the last 2 chapters. And so we haven't gone through those before. So, so the first 2 are homeostasis. The third one is neurotransmitters and how they work. So neurotransmitters, this stuff is chapter 11, the nervous system, and these are chemical messengers that either can cause an action potential or inhibit one. And so they do that through a receptor. And then whatever the receptor is linked to, it's usually an ion channel. And that ion channel, if it lets sodium out, it's excitatory. If it lets potassium in, it's inhibitory. And so these are usually ion channels, and that's usually how they work. Okay, so that first question, you'll get one of those 2. The second question deal with the stuff in chapter 15 and 16. So the first one is the anatomy and physiology, explain the anatomy and physiology of the fight or flight response. So that's part of the autonomic nervous system. That's peripheral nerves that are controlling visceral responses. And so this is this sympathetic division. These are, let's see, that's the thoracic and lumbar spinal nerves, okay, that are sending a short neuron to a ganglia, like the sympathetic chain ganglia or some of the other big ganglia that are in the abdominal region, and then a long second nerve that goes to the organ. And so that second nerve, in the case of these guys, is usually going to release norepinephrine or epinephrine. Okay, and so in general, so that's the anatomy. It's thoracic and lumbar spinal nerves. It's a big ganglia close to the spinal cord. And then the physiology of these is usually releasing epinephrine or norepinephrine at an organ. Okay, and in general, this is going to get us ready to deal with a dangerous situation, like if you see a bear, so that you can fight or that you can run away. And so it's going to do things like turn down digestion. So it'll inhibit digestion, it'll inhibit urine formation, it'll inhibit movement of the digestive organs. On the other hand, it'll increase heart rate, dilate the airwaves, and cause the adrenal glands to release adrenaline. And so that would probably be enough for that, is those things. Okay. And then the mental status exam, that's part of the neurological exam. And that's examining the cerebrum, what's going on in the cerebrum through a series of questions. Okay. And the observation of the patient. And so you're looking at their ability to do a lot of things in their cerebrum. So you'll ask them questions on orientation. What is the date, the day of the week? Where are you? What city are you in? Do you know what time of day it is? Do you know how old you are? Who is the president? And so you're assessing their ability to orient. You'll also assess their ability to do language, and that's kind of the ability to understand directions and to respond appropriately to questions. And so you ask them questions. There's some sensorium in here, so you ask them, you might you might make a sound and ask them to describe it. You might brush their hand and ask them to do what they feel. You'll ask them questions about memory, so you might repeat a couple words or a couple phrases and ask them to repeat it. And so you can identify things like language deficits, short-term memory loss. You can identify various types of dementia. You'll also might ask them about some reasoning and judgment issues. So in your book, they talk about asking them, giving them a proverb and asking them to explain it. Like you might say something like, what does it mean when we say the early bird gets the worm? And so something simple like that, because they might not be able to do it. And so this is really important in healthcare, because you're going to ask people, you're going to explain a procedure that you might be doing. And if you have any doubt that they understand, it's important to find out, because they, like I talked about with my dad, he couldn't, if you explained to him he was going to get COVID-19 was here and you needed to vaccinate him, does he want to be vaccinated? He couldn't understand it. By the time you got to the end of the explanation, he couldn't remember what was in the beginning. And so he might react really strangely to getting vaccinated because he wouldn't understand why. He just couldn't understand that. And you wouldn't, you might not necessarily know that unless you start kind of sitting back and saying, okay, can he, does he know where he is? Does he have the ability to even remember 3 words out of a sentence? Bicycle, haircut, chop suey. And please repeat that, because if they can't repeat those first words, it doesn't matter what you explain to them, they've forgotten it. And so, and this can happen to people who are relatively young and who look good. And, like my dad, you wouldn't notice it. If you just met him, because my mom was taking care of him. She was, she'd get him up, she'd comb his hair, she'd wash him up, she'd dress him. He looked like he was able to do those things, but it wasn't him, it was my mom that was doing that. And so he had a nice vocabulary still. He could still play the piano. He had memorized many jokes. So he could still seem kind of witty and with it, but he couldn't understand his healthcare decisions. And so that's important with the mental status exam. Okay. All right. So there's those essay questions for you to look at. There's also a practice exam that's a little longer that you can look at, and that has stuff from all the way there. Let's see. Okay, so let's go. I have some review stuff, so let's just go look at the review stuff. Okay, it's okay, people. I'm going to do everything a couple times here. So, all right, it was my fault for screwing up on the Zoom link. Okay, so some people had a question: is the exam going to be longer? Yes, it'll be about 50% longer, because it's worth a little more than the other exams. Okay, so instead of being 100 points, it'll be 150. So figure the essays will be worth probably maybe 5 more points, and then there'll be probably another 20 questions or so. So it'll be maybe 50% longer. So like 60 questions with 2 essays instead of 40. It'll be the same format, multiple choice with true, false, and then 2 essay questions. Okay, it opens on Friday. It'll be open Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and closes Monday night. So potentially you have a week left. Okay, so that's where we got it here. So okay, so let's see if I can get that. Okay, so those the 2 guys The one guy crammed, studied, the other guy didn't. He's kind of got a pointy head. Okay, so the, obviously with anatomy and physiology, this is not how intelligent you are. This is about how much time you've put in. Okay, so if you spend lots of times, and we know how memory works, that memory works to put something in long-term memory, you need repetition. So it's best to have short chunks, like 10 minutes, and then a break, another short chunk, 10 minutes, and do that over a period of days with some sleep in between. That's called distributed review, and that's the best way to learn. Okay, it's the easiest way. And so whenever you have hard stuff, that's the way to go. And particularly when you have hard things that are memory heavy, like anatomy and physiology, it's memory heavy. We tend to learn best when we're active. So when we're writing, or when we're taking notes, that really helps you learn when you take notes. It helps you when you speak. Okay, and so studying with a partner is good. Self-quizzing, flashcards, those are all good things because they're active methods. Making notes, making review sheets, those are really good. So again, plan your time, take breaks. It's too late to read the whole book. We covered over 700 pages. And so you can't do that, but you can look at chapter summaries. You can look at headings. You can look at, at every chapter, there's a big list of vocabulary words. Each week you had a study guide. And so there was a list of vocabulary words with the study guide. There's also a nice summary at the end of each week. That's stuff you can look over. And so that's a really good way to do it. So again, chapter summaries, vocabularies, everything's on Moodle. So the way to do this is frequent short sessions, or if you're going to plan a long session, then break it up. So like for me, that's trips to the refrigerator and stuff like that. And so frequent short study sessions. So I might sit down to study something for 3 hours, but I won't stay in the chair the whole time. I'll do 15 minutes a crack, and I'll have little snacks in between, stuff like that. Okay. So there's a bunch of topics that I think are really important. Homeostasis is one of them, cells, maybe the general tissue types, the functions of the skin. That's really important. What does the skin do and why? Also with skin color is important, skin color, because that's protecting you from skin cancer. Whenever there's a disorder, often that's a really important disorder we covered, that's often important. So like skin cancer, the most common type of cancer is skin cancers. Other important topics, skeletal system functions, bone growth and development, calcium homeostasis, that's important. Synovial joints, functions of synovial joints, muscle functions, muscle cells, different types of muscle cells, that's histology, muscle tissues. When I say muscle physiology, that's the sliding filament theory of contraction. Nervous system organization, function, neurons, membrane potential, synapses, neurotransmitters, brain regions, functions attached to those, eye and ear physiology, kind of motor control kind of could be in there. That's that somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, that's sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, and neurological exam, but particularly mental status exam. Okay, stuff I might ask you, but won't be a huge deal. Anatomical position and relative position, those are probably, there'll be 1 or 2 questions on those. A body cavity, maybe organ systems. In general, a lot of chemistry kind of, we kind of get to it every once in a while. But I won't ask you like elements or things like that, but I might ask you about water or proteins or DNA. I might ask you about cell structures, mitosis, making proteins, tissues. When we talk about the skin, what kind of tissue makes up the upper layer and the lower layer, that kind of stuff. Okay, stuff I probably won't ask at all is basic chemistry, atoms, elements, protons, neutrons. Probably not going to ask that. You won't have to identify tissues or bones or joint structures. There's no diagrams. I won't do muscle ID. That's lab stuff. I won't ask about, what is the origin of this muscle or the insertion of this muscle or the action of that muscle. That's lab stuff. So these important topics: homeostasis, maintaining a stable internal environment. Almost always cells function best under a narrow range of conditions, like within 1 or 2 degrees of temperature, having a very limited amount of calcium available. Too low, bad; too high, bad. It's got to be in this narrow range. And so we control things so that cells can function well. Okay, almost always this is negative feedback. Okay, negative feedback means a change is detected and then something is going to oppose that change. And so we have to have some sort of sensory receptor or something that detects the change, the control system that can then activate a response, and then the responding organs, the effectors. So like with skin temp or with body temperature, we have temperature receptors in our skin, we have them in our blood vessels, and these things activate a brain region, the hypothalamus, that can control blood vessels in the skin. It can control sweat glands. It can send information that causes muscles to shiver. It can control these things. It can do all sorts of stuff. And so, the thermostat in your house is basically doing the same thing. It can turn on and off the furnace or the AC. Okay. So then, another really important idea is that you're made of cells. Okay, cells are truly alive. These are small, microscopic, but they're what are doing things. And you are made up of lots of different types of cells. These cells have little parts within them that do specific jobs, the organelles, plasma membrane, nucleus, ribosomes, mitochondria. That's the core of it. And so lots of stuff happens right at the plasma membrane, action potentials, nerves signaling things, stuff like that happens at the plasma membrane. The nucleus controls the DNA that determines what proteins are made. Different cells make different proteins. That's why they look different. Ribosomes make the proteins, and mitochondria are the main source of energy. That's where we burn sugars and fats to get energy. Okay. So then skin structure, the upper layer of the skin is the epidermis. Okay. That contains protein, keratin. Skin makes lots of keratin. No other real tissues make keratin. Skin also makes melanin. That bottom layer of the skin, there are melanocytes that makes melanin that protects us from ultraviolet light damaging the lower layers of the skin. Okay, that's the epidermis. Those are the big topics there. This is thick skin. It's an epithelium because it's on the surface. Below that epithelium is the dermis. That's fibrous connective tissue as the main tissue, but then there's lots of other stuff in there like hair, various glands, sweat glands, sebaceous glands. Nails are formed in there. Again, they're made out of keratin. Okay, temperature regulation, that happens in the dermis. Okay, by changing blood flow, we can lose heat or conserve heat. By changing the activity of sweat glands, we can increase evaporation to get rid of heat, or we can decrease it to save heat. So big deals. Sensory structures in the skin, we don't talk much about them, but they're there. Okay, so that in each organ system, I also talked about these functions. Okay, and so skin functions are important. Skin's a big job in protection. Does temperature, homeostasis. So that's what this picture is. Shows a nice kind of balance board there. what happens when temperature goes up, what happens when it goes down. And then skin does tiny amounts of excretion, tiny amounts of vitamin D stuff and sensation. Okay. So let me stop for a second there. Does anybody have any questions? Is that helpful? Okay.
Yes.
So the first part of the course is some background, like homeostasis, cells, and tissues. The skin is the first organ system, and that's kind of the template for going through all the organ systems, kind of the general functions of the organ system, the specific tissues involved, the cells involved, the structures, and then usually some details on the most important thing. For us, we talked a lot about temperature regulation and a lot about melanin and protection from ultraviolet light and skin cancer. Okay, so that, and we talked a lot about skin cancer because that's important. Yes, good.
Yeah, it's good. Are
Okay.
we gonna have like a lab test too, or just this one?
Just this one.
Okay.
So the lab stuff, I wanted to get you in lab to see it, because hopefully next semester, hopefully everyone will get vaccinated and we won't have COVID and we'll be able to be in the lab for the whole time. So I wanted to get you in lab twice, but it wouldn't be fair to for me to give you a lab test. So make sure you get in the last couple assignments, pictures of the brain and the eye. I think I've got most of the grades posted for the worksheets. I will have time if you missed the worksheets, one of the worksheets tomorrow between 9 and 11. I will have both of those set up, and so you can come in and redo them or do them if you haven't. But it's between 9 and 11 in N124 tomorrow.
So if we already did both worksheets, we don't have to come in?
If you already did
Okay.
them both, you don't have to come in.
Okay.
Okay. Let's see. So I'm going to go back and explain more. Okay. So let's go back to sharing, and I'll talk more about it, and we'll see how things go. Okay. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. Okay. So get bigger. Okay, so that gets us back to skin. So this idea that do people see skin functions?
Yes, I can see that.
Okay, thank you. So with each organ system, usually in the book and in somewhere in the presentation I made, that there's a list of the functions. So this is a really important slide. And it's a really important thing to kind of figure out. I have to figure out what each of these organ systems is supposed to do in a fair amount of detail, because it will ask about that. Okay, so like skeletal system. So I like this slide. Skeletal system functions. It functions for support, so with skeleton and without. It protects the organs. The skeletal system allows movement and growth. So it's not only providing support, but it's support for movement and determines the range of movements. It's really important for mineral storage, particularly calcium, but also phosphate. It stores fat. And then we don't talk about it much, but this is where blood cell production occurs. So particularly red blood cell production, which occurs throughout life. It occurs within the red bone marrow, in the ends of the bone. And so that's going on all the time. And so we talked about a lot here about mineral storage and homeostasis, and less about everything else. But maybe a little bit about growth, because we talked about bone growth. And so quite a bit about mineral storage. So that gives you an idea. That's a big topic. And of course, what did we talk about as far as disorders with the skeletal system? We talked about osteoporosis, because that's a homeostatic disorder where calcium is continually withdrawn from the skeleton because of changes in activity patterns of people and diet and then aging, which makes it harder and harder to store calcium. Okay, so I probably won't give you a diagram of bone, but here is where we talked about the general structures of a long bone. This is an organ. And so the diaphysis, the epiphysis, the two main regions, the diaphysis is the shaft, the epiphysis is the end. The diaphysis has within it the medullary cavity. Okay, the medullary cavity has yellow bone marrow, which is adipose tissue inside. Then the epiphysis, inside that, instead of a single cavity, you have spongy bone, which you have lots of small spaces where that's where you have the red bone marrow. And then there's a membrane that wraps around that, that's periosteum. That's where there's a lot of cells that are active in bone remodeling and bone repair. So the osteoblasts and osteoclasts are in an adult bone. That's where they're located. They're mostly active there. And so they're important that way. In bone growth and bone formation and growth, we talked about cartilage bone and membrane bones. Cartilage bones form in the embryo as a cartilage model, and then that cartilage is replaced by bone. But it's not completely replaced as long as you're growing in height. And so if you're growing in height, there's always a cartilage pad called the epiphyseal disc or plate that's there, and it's the cartilage is growing and bone is growing there and replacing cartilage. That's the growth plate. That if a child breaks a bone, that's what they want to check, is the growth plate okay? Because if the growth plate's not okay, there's going to be problems. That arm or leg won't grow, and that can happen if there's a break there. Let's see what happened there. Then, of course, the big topic is calcium homeostasis. So this is calcium is really important because it's needed for muscle cells. You need calcium to initiate a contraction. It's also needed for nerve cells. Calcium moves into the neuron at the synapse to cause the release of neurotransmitters. And so if calcium levels are too low, your nerve cells don't work and your muscle cells don't work. That's bad. You'll die. And so calcium can be withdrawn from the skeleton. Even if you've got osteoporosis, your body will do that because you need calcium for your muscles and nerves. So we maintain these normal levels, and two glands do this, or two sets of glands. The thyroid gland, if calcium levels are high, the thyroid gland releases calcitonin, and this is going to affect tissues that in such a way that they reduce calcium levels in the blood. So the bones start storing calcium, the intestine stops absorbing calcium from meals, and then the kidneys allow calcium to be excreted. Okay, so they don't resorb it. On the other hand, if calcium levels are too low, it's the parathyroid gland releasing parathyroid hormone, PTH. Okay, PTH is going to help bring calcium levels back up, okay, by increasing calcium uptake from your meals, by reducing calcium loss from the urine, but mostly in a fast sense, it's going to release it from the bone. And so that's, if the calcium's not present in food, it's going to release it from the bone. So this is a negative feedback system. This is important for the skeletal system. This is one of the main deals. Okay, so then I should have a slide here about the joints. The joints allow growth, again, growth, shape changes, and then of course movement. For the muscular system produces body movements. It holds things in position, posture. I'm contracting muscles in my neck so my head doesn't flop over. Skeletal muscles move the diaphragm up and down, so that brings air into the lungs for ventilation or respiration. Muscles produce excess heat, so that can help regulate body temperature. Muscles are involved in speech, so communication for there, facial expression, those are muscles. And then you have muscles in organs and vessels. The heart pumps blood, it's a muscle. The intestines move food. The tubes of the excretory system pump urine. So most movements are produced by muscles. Okay, so muscles, here you have some really specialized cells. That's a really important thing, is that these cells are really highly unusually in shape. So they have a specialized cell membrane called the sarcolemma, and it has deep pits called the transverse tubules, so that when an action potential starts at its surface, it can go deep into the muscle cell. Then it has unusual sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is a modified endoplasmic reticulum that stores calcium. Okay, and when an action potential happens at the surface, the sarcoplasmic reticulum releases calcium to start a muscle contraction. That calcium has to get into the myofibrils. Those are bundles of protein that will change shape to force the cell together. And then these cells have more than one nucleus and many, many, many mitochondria. So a very unusual cell. Okay. So the way these contract is that the filaments slide past one another. So you have these filaments that can slide past one another, kind of the way your fingers can sometimes have a little overlap and sometimes have a lot of overlap. So they kind of go like that. Those proteins in there are actin and myosin, and they need two things. They need ATP for energy to pull themselves together, and calcium. And then they form cross bridges. So that's the sliding filament theory. Okay, here to do this, they need energy, and that energy can come from two sources. Aerobic, okay, which means it uses oxygen. Okay, and so this type of metabolism happens in the mitochondria. It requires oxygen, so there's lots of blood vessels, and there's even a pigment to store oxygen in the muscles that's called myoglobin. And this type of energy could use glucose or fat as the ultimate energy source, and it just produces carbon dioxide. Okay, and so this is, aerobic means you can do it for a long time. Aerobic muscles will have a good blood supply, things like that. Okay, anaerobic sources of energy can produce energy faster, but they can only use glucose, and they don't need oxygen, so they have fewer blood vessels, and they don't store oxygen, so they don't have myoglobin. And they can't use fat for this. They can only use glucose, and they only partially use it. So instead of breaking it down to carbon dioxide, they produce lactic acid, which accumulates and causes muscle fatigue. So sprinters, like you see here, can only use this source of energy for about 30 seconds, 30, maybe 45 seconds. So it's sprints, like a sprinter here, they can run at almost 30 miles an hour, maybe even a little bit above, so really top sprinters. Okay, a marathoner, they run at about 12 miles an hour. So, but they can do it for a couple hours. Okay, sprinters are done in 30 seconds. And so a marathoner might go 2 hours. The best marathoners do around 2 hours, and they're going 12, 13 miles an hour, somewhere in there. Okay. All right. So nervous system, nervous system functions to receive sensory input, to control muscle activities, and to integrate things, to take several inputs and determine an appropriate output. So that's homeostatic activity, it's mental activity, things like that. Most integration happens in the central nervous system. The sensory input and motor output, that's carried by peripheral nerves in the peripheral nervous system. Oops, what happened there? Okay, hold on. Okay, so, all right. So again, these divisions, central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. Okay, I should ask, do you see the division structure, Guy? Maybe?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. All right, so there's a lot here. Here, we talked about the individual cells, which there are several types of nerve cells. The most important type are neurons. Neurons are the cells that have the membrane potentials and release neurotransmitters. The other cells are all support cells. We call them glial cells. And there's, 4 or 5 in the central nervous system and 3 or 4 in the peripheral nervous system. The neurons are large and long-lived. The glial cells are small. They undergo mitosis more often, but they're abundant. Okay, so with neurons, they can have these membrane potentials. Okay, where the charge of the membrane swings. The membrane, the inside of the cell is negative, but it can become briefly positive. Okay, and so this happens when ion channels open and ions move. And then this spreads over the surface of the neuron quite fast. We're talking milliseconds. Okay. Then neurons signal other neurons, and they do this at a synapse with a chemical messenger called a neurotransmitter. So when the signal goes from the body of the nerve cell all the way down towards the axon, and it reaches the end of the axon, there's a slight swelling where neurotransmitters are stored. And when the action potential gets there, when sodium ions move into the cell, at the synapse, there's actually calcium channels. And the calcium channels trigger, when they open, they trigger the movement of little vesicles that store neurotransmitter. And those vesicles will fuse with the cell membrane and release their molecules into the gap between one neuron and the next. And the neuron will then have to bind to a receptor molecule. And whatever that receptor is linked to, that will be the action of that neurotransmitter. So the receptor might be released to a sodium or attached to a sodium channel, so that when the neurotransmitter hits the receptor, the sodium channel opens and sodium ions enter the cell and the cell is excited. On the other hand, if the neurotransmitter binds to a receptor that is linked to a potassium channel, potassium goes out, and then the cell becomes even more negative and it's inhibited. And so that's inhibitory. So there's lots of different neurotransmitters, and the effect they have is determined by the receptor. And so the same neurotransmitter can have different effects on different cells. Okay, so that's the kind of cell stuff. Then we went into kind of bigger things. And so this is a cross section of a brain kind of, and you can really just see structures of the cerebrum and structures of the diencephalon here. And so the cerebrum has the cortex on its surface, which is gray matter. That's where the neurons are most abundant, where there's lots of synapses. And then inside of it, it'll have connecting fibers. And those connecting fibers are myelinated, so they appear white. So here you see the two sides of the cerebrum. I think we're looking at a section, and so this is almost certainly this region up here is parietal lobe, and then this is temporal lobe here. And then this bridge going across the center, that bridge is the corpus callosum. And then here you can see a little bit of the diencephalon. That's the thalamus, and probably there is hypothalamus. Okay. So the biggest part of the brain is the cerebrum. That sits on top of the diencephalon, relatively small, which sits on top of the brainstem, also relatively small. That has the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. Humans, when you looked at your sheep brain, sheep are about as big as people. I don't know if anybody here has sheep. Let me stop. Does anybody have sheep? No? Usually I have somebody that has sheep. So sheep, a good sized ram is 200 pounds, maybe 250. That's bigger than most people. And so sheep and people have kind of the same body size, but how was your sheep brain? I mean, it was tiny. Okay, sheep have tiny little brains, and in particular, the areas of their brain that are small are the cerebrum, okay, including the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobes, And then the cerebellum is small. Okay. And so, and that makes sense if you think about it, because we have all this frontal lobe processing, and we have this ability to do lots of things like math and language, which largely happen in the frontal lobe, and lots of judgment and stuff like that. But we also have lots of motor activity that's really complex. Think of speech. That's all muscle activity. That's a huge amount of muscle activity that's going on that sheep never have to do. Sheep just, they make about 4 sounds. We can make we have this really fine control of vocal stuff. And it's a lot of frontal lobe activity, but it's also a lot of cerebellum activity, because we do a lot of that as kind of pattern learning. And then think about things you do with your hands and your feet. I mean, we really do complex locomotion type stuff. So we have big cerebellums compared to sheep. Ours are huge, and because we do lots of really complex activities with different parts of our body, and we had, it's not just all judgment. We do lots of complex motor stuff, and so we have that going on as well. Okay, so again, make sure your name's in here. We're combining 2 classes today. So we're just having everything. So I'm just going to keep going over, so you can ask questions. You can ask them out loud, or I stop and check. So yes, the final is going to be longer. So let's go back and look at the first screen here. So let's go back and share. Okay, so the final is going to be longer. So it's about 50% longer. So it's normally exams are 100 points. This is going to be about 150. It'll be the same. 2 essay questions with a lot of multiple choice and true false. I'll reuse some questions. There'll be some new questions. Okay, so it's the same, but maybe a third of the exam is on the last 2 chapters, chapter 15 and chapter 16, because you haven't had an exam on that. So it's some review, but it's also some of the new stuff. And then if you want to remember to kind of look over old materials, you have about a week. The exam's going to open on Friday, and it'll close Monday, a week from today at midnight. So you have about a week. You can't reread the textbook. It's too much. There's 700 pages, but you can look at your notes. You can look at chapter summaries. You can look at the study guides. You can look at the vocabulary lists at the back of in the end of each chapter. You can look over your old quizzes and old exams. Those things are important to look at, because I'll be using questions from those. And remember, we know about how memory works now. We know how memory works. Memory works by putting things in your temporal lobe. Repetition is important. So lots of repetition. Short chunks are important. So 10 or 15 minutes at a crack, then walk out, check what's in the refrigerator, check the cabinet for cookies, do that kind of stuff, and then go back to it, and that's a really good way to look at things. Chapter summaries, vocabulary, look at old quizzes and exams. Short chunks will help, and of course it helps to write, to be active, to write review sheets, to mark up old tests or something like that, mark up old notes that you've taken. The more you can write and speak when you study with a partner, that's helpful, because if you say it, you're likely to remember it. Okay. All right, so let's go back to where I was, if I can find that. Okay, so does anybody see brain area stuff? Yes, someone?
Yep, you can see it.
Okay, so here, cerebrum is really important. The diencephalon is really important. because the thalamus is this big sensory relay, and the hypothalamus is the most important visceral control center because it's controlling what goes on in your organs. Okay, the brainstem is more visceral control, more relay of sensory stuff like that. The cerebellum is another kind of motor activity helper. And so those are important things there. We spent a lot of time on the cerebrum because it's this huge area. We talked about the different lobes, what goes on in the different lobes. That's important. We talked about speech areas. There's a speech area in the frontal lobe. That makes sense because frontal lobe does a lot of motor stuff. So that's the motor speech area that controls what's, when I'm talking, that controls the muscles that produce speech. The speech area in the temporal and parietal lobe, that's the sensory speech area, or sometimes it's called the general interpretive area. That those areas help us interpret speech. And so different parts of the brain have to cooperate in speech. And so that's why we test speech in the mental status exam, because that requires these different areas to be working. And so we do a lot of stuff with examining speech because it tells us a lot about what's going on in the cerebrum. Frontal lobe areas are really important because this also, in addition to motor, the premotor areas are involved with those executive functions. So that's like attention, working memory, judgment, thoughts, and things like that. It's impulse control and controlling emotional responses. Again, the mental status exam, you ask them questions, you ask them interpretive things. So you say things like, what does it mean when the early bird gets the worm? And trying to ask them to explain that, because that checks on, well, the interpretation of that speech requires the parietal lobe, the sensory area. It requires the frontal lobe, the prefrontal area, and then it requires Broca's area, because they've got to be able to answer the question. And so it's some pretty complex processing. And so people that are impaired may have trouble with it. Or they may be able to do it, but only with some help, some prompting, and it just won't flow fluently. And so that's kind of a mental status exam stuff. Okay. Then we talked about the somatic brain. This is doing things in the cerebrum. And so this involves sensory, but also motor stuff and these pathways going down. And so these pathways are complex, involving not only the cerebrum, but also some sub-cerebral structures, and particularly the cerebellum. Okay, I won't ask you to give me this, but I'll ask you to, what is a motor pathway, and explain why these things why there's multiple ones, or why they're doing different things. Okay, then the other parts of the somatic area are sensory somatic, which involves the perception of things like vision. So here we have to understand not only the pathway, which is the optic nerve, the second cranial nerve goes to through the thalamus, through the eye, and then goes to the occipital areas, but also understanding the organ that you have. You have a cornea and you have a lens that bend the light and then put an image on the retina, and the receptor cells are on the retina. And these receptor cells detect light by having these pigments that then cause an impulse to occur when the pigment changes from the combined form to the split form. So the option is the split form, and so that will cause the impulse. And so this is just showing the rhodopsin. When light hits it, it comes apart into the opsin and retinol form, and that's what triggers the impulse. Okay, likewise, another complex somatic thing is how we detect sound. Vibrations hit the eardrum, are transmitted by bones to the fluid of the inner ear, and then those fluid vibrations and fluid are picked up by little hair cells. And there's thousands of these hair cells, and depending on how strongly they're vibrated and which ones, how far up the cochlea they're vibrated, we can detect the type of sound. And so this is the 7th cranial nerve, vestibular cochlear nerve, that carries this to areas of the parietal and temporal lobe. Okay, and we also detect things like balance there. In, again, using hair cells in like the vestibule, this is how we detect the position of the head, which is static equilibrium, or we can detect rotation of the head, which is the semicircular canals. But again, fluid flowing in the canals is what's going to trigger these hair cells to move. Okay. All right. So that was the somatic system. Then we came to the chapter 15, the autonomic nervous system. These are peripheral nerves that are motor nerves that can activate smooth muscle and glands. This autonomic system has 2 neurons that go from the central nervous system to the organ. Somatic motor control has 1 neuron. And here, these visceral organs generally get both parasympathetic and sympathetic innervation. So it's not like a skeletal muscle where it's just 1 neuron going to a skeletal muscle and it contracts. Here you have 2 neurons going to a visceral organ, one releasing acetylcholine, the parasympathetic one, the other one releasing norepinephrine. That's the sympathetic one. Okay. And so one is the rest and digest system, the other is fight or flight. Okay. The parasympathetic comes from cranial nerves and sacral spinal nerves. Okay. It has a long first neuron and a short second neuron, and it releases acetylcholine. This is going to activate the digestive system. It'll activate the kidney to produce urine. It will tend to make the lungs, airways less open, and it'll cause the heart to slow down. Okay. The sympathetic system goes to the same organs, but it does the opposite effect. It will cause the kidneys to become inactive, stop urine formation. It'll stop digestion and movement of digestive juices, movement of food contents in the intestine. It'll cause the liver to not produce bile. On the other hand, it will make the heart beat harder and faster. It'll dilate the airways of the lung, and it'll cause the adrenal gland to release adrenaline, which will cause the muscles to contract very hard. It'll change blood flow to different organs, all sorts of stuff like that. Okay, so this parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions, these are peripheral nerves, okay, but they're not acting totally independent. Okay, they're not acting independent of all central nervous system functions. In fact, the main visceral control centers are in the brain. Okay, one of the biggest ones is the hypothalamus, the most important ones. It's the autonomic control center for heart rate, blood pressure. It regulates food intake. It regulates water balance. It regulates temperature, hunger, controls endocrine system. It's really, really important. It's an emotional control center. It's our main visceral regulator. The only comparable one is in the medulla, but this is the main one. So these are really, really important. And this is closely linked up with other areas of the brain. It has close links with the other visceral control centers in the pons and in the medulla. There's linkages with the higher centers in the diencephalon and in the cerebrum. It's influenced by what goes on in the cortex. It's influenced by what goes on emotionally, and it also has an influence with them. So regulation of autonomic activities is central nervous system function, and it's that same limbic system that controls emotions and influences memory also has strong influence on the hypothalamus. So they say the mind-body connection, often what they're talking about is this limbic system kind of connection to the hypothalamus. And so, that's that kind of stress response I talked about, that some people are more calm because they can kind of damp down on that limbic system response, and that dampens down the hypothalamus. And other people are hyper, and so they exaggerate that. Okay, so then chapter 16, the neurological exam. Okay, this is using relatively simple tools and kind of questions and your knowledge of what goes on in the nervous system. These are a series of ways to evaluate the nervous system. Okay, and we focus on the mental status exam, but you can also examine cranial nerve functions, which can tell you about very specific brain regions. You do this by, having people follow the movement of your finger with their eyes. That tells you about the muscles that control the eyes. Can they do these things nice and smoothly? You ask them to move their tongue. It tells you about another cranial nerve. You have them move their head. These things are cranial nerve functions. We also can examine some of the spinal nerves and sensory areas of the brain by doing a sensory exam. We can do some motor exams that can help us. And the gait exam, the coordination and gait exam, tells us about the cerebellum, tells us about the nerve pathways that involve coordination. And like the sobriety exam that the police officer gives you to test to do this field test if you've been drinking, that's a variation of this coordination and gait exam. He wants you to walk a straight line. And what alcohol does is it impairs that function. And if you can't do that, that's a pretty good sign that you've been drinking, and maybe he should go ahead and give you a breathalyzer or test the blood alcohol level. And so they can do very simple things like this. But as I mentioned, this is important because it can allow you to assess what's going on in the nervous system, which is this really important system that's doing homeostasis, doing these visceral responses. It can tell you about what's going on inside. A variation of this is what you do when you're testing someone for stroke. So really important that way. Also, for us in college, it can help us think about ways of improving memory and improving our retention of things so that we can move on to the next step of this career pathway that we're on. And so things get put into long-term memory when we repeatedly are exposed to them. So repetition is one of the key things. Also, if we can link an experience or something with something we already know, or with an action that we take, or our previous experience, that can help us put it into memory faster. Things that are linked to strong emotions affect memory. In this case, both good and bad. That really strong traumatic experiences can impair memory because these strong negative experiences alter memory and help us kind of avoid them. We also know that forming long-term memory happens during sleep. And so this consolidation happens during sleep and can be impaired by lack of sleep or disturbed sleep. People that have sleep apnea, that's a symptom, is they have impaired memory formation. And so it's one of the ways we tell. We also, for the mental status exam, that helps us identify people that have dementia, and can help us talk about specific types of dementia and managing dementia. Dementia has many causes. If you're going to work in healthcare, the people that are most heavily use healthcare systems that are most at risk of things like COVID are older people. That's just the way it is. And so we want to know if they're impaired, that if they have these different types of dementia. And so and there's different ways of dementia. We can have dementia going forward where we can't form new memories, or we can have loss or damage to old memories. Like for instance, I talk about my dad. My dad had some of his old memories intact, childhood memories. Some of those were quite intact. He could still identify all family members, extended family members. That wasn't a problem for him. Most of those memories were okay. He could not form new memories. And so that was a problem. In day-to-day life, that was a huge problem because he would turn on the stove and forget it. He would start something and forget it. He would open the door and forget to close it, and then get cold. He needed a full-time caretaker because he couldn't form new memories. And anything he did 2 minutes ago was completely lost. And so that was a problem. Dementia can also, if we have impaired memory, we can have lots of difficulty with problem solving. Also, it's likely that if we're having some of these issues, we can also have other issues with loss of motor functions, loss of balance, speech and language difficulties, mood changes. For my father, wandering was one of the problems. He was never sure where he was or why he was there. And so that led to wandering. And kind of the important thing is when he had to interact with healthcare providers, it was important for them to understand he was pretty heavily impaired. Even though he looked pretty good, he was dressed well, and was still interested in other people and able to converse. You might not notice if you just had a 30-second conversation with him that he had dementia. You might not be able to do that. But if you started asking him questions, where are you? What day is it? Where do you live? Why are you here? Then you would pretty soon realize he was not able to make healthcare decisions. But if a physician came in and just started explaining a procedure, and would ask my dad, do you want to do that? He might not know. This guy had no clue what he said. And so this was really important. And of course, this is related to changes that happen. And they can happen because of aging. They can happen because of infection. It can be traumatic injury, can cause this. Blows to the head can cause this. Stroke can cause this. Car accidents can cause this. You can have these types of changes, at any age, and you can't identify it necessarily by just looking at the person. And so it's important to know that. And like with these people also, this dementia changes can also happen with prefrontal area changes. And so this can impair thoughts and judgments. It can impair emotional responses, limbic responses. They can become agitated easily. They can become combative. And so under strange circumstances, they may become combative. And so you can get a fear response sometimes because they don't understand what's going on. Giving my dad a shot was a challenge because no matter how many times you explained it, he couldn't get it. And so he just know, wow, someone really jabbed me and I didn't know why. so that was going to be, a flu shot was a major challenge. And it didn't matter how kind the nurse was, how gentle she was, he could not understand it. And so it's a major thing, and he could become combative over that. Okay. All right, so let me stop that. Was that at all helpful to anybody?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know. Caroline, do you want to say anything about?
I was just gonna ask what you thought would be best for SI. Would it be better to combine the two sessions? Do you want me to go over like essay questions? I'm just not sure what would be the best review for
Okay.
Wednesday.
I would leave that to you and to students.
Okay.
I think it's helpful to review general stuff. I think the practice exam is a good memory jogger, and so
Okay.
um,
Yeah, if there's a practice exam for this, we can go over that.
yeah.
Final.
I think, kind of reviewing your experience, how you felt it was,
Mhm.
that's helpful.
Okay.
It's organizing a big mass of stuff. And so, how you did it can help others. And giving them some idea about what not to study, what
Mhm.
not to spend your time on. And so,
Right.
that's why I say don't try and reread the chapters. If you're going to reread anything, reread the summaries, go to specific sections, but don't try and reread a chapter. It's not worth
Yeah.
it. And so this is the time to do other things.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll post those Zoom links for Wednesday today probably, and then we'll meet on Wednesday, probably go over the practice exam and just some study tips and any other questions people might have.
Okay. That's good. People have generally said that's been very helpful. So.
Okay.
And is that
Sounds
gonna be at
good.
11 or 11:30?
We'll just do it by section. So if you're in the 11 o'clock section, usually it'll be at 11, and then the 11:30, people who usually go at 11:30 will be at 11:30.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So I have a recording for this. I'll post the whole recording, I think, just because it's a review and some people may have missed it. So, okay. Good luck. Remember, there's if you've missed any of the in-person lab stuff tomorrow between 9 and 11, that's open and you can come in and do that. I'll be posting more grade stuff in the next couple days, so I should finish up with the grading. I'm kind of close for some stuff, but when people turn in stuff late, I have to go back and redo everything, so it takes me some time. All right. Okay. Thank you for staying long if you did. I hope it's helpful. I'll see you later. Okay. Bye.